Nenagh Jail, the Cormack brothers, a miscarriage of justice. May 11th, 1858, Nenagh, Ireland. A crowd gathered outside the prison gates. They came to witness what executions did in those days. Watch a man dying by hanging. But what they saw that morning wasn't justice. It was something else entirely. Two brothers stood on the scaffold. Daniel and William Cormack. Local men, farmers. They had proclaimed their innocence for months, and on that scaffold, facing certain death, they proclaimed it again. Lord, have mercy on me, for you know, Jesus, that I neither had hand, act, nor part in that for which I am about to die. Good people, pray for me. Their bodies fell, the rope went taut, and within minutes it was over. But the mystery was just beginning, because 52 years later it was revealed the Cormack brothers were innocent, and everyone knew it. This is the Emerald Mysteries podcast, and today we're exploring one of Ireland's most famous miscarriages of justice. A case so controversial it shook the foundations of Irish politics and the British legal system. The question isn't whether the Cormack brothers did it. The question is, how did a corrupt judge, a perjuring witness, and a botched investigation send two innocent men to the gallows? And what does that tell us about power, injustice, and the costs of being on the wrong side of the law in the 19th century Ireland? October 22nd, 1857, late evening, a narrow country lane near Templemore, County Tipperary. John Ellis is being driven home from Templemore railway station. Ellis is a land agent, a Scottish man, educated, well-dressed, with authority. He's worked with John Trant, a wealthy landlord, for 25 years. His servant, Thomas Burke, is driving the cart. As they turn down the lane, near Killahara, the cart slows. The horse stops. Something is blocking the way. Uprooted bushes and branches scattered across the road. Burke gets down to clear it. Ellis remains in the cart. And then, a gunshot, close, powerful. Ellis is hit in the chest. Burke turns and sees a figure disappearing into the darkness, but not before recognizing the face, or so he will later claim. Ellis dies within the hour. The shot that killed John Ellis created a shockwave through County Tipperary. Here's why. John Ellis wasn't just a land agent, he was the face of eviction. For a quarter century he'd been the man who had showed up at tenants' doors and told families they had to leave. He carried the authority of a landlord absent from Ireland, a Scottish landlord who lived far away, extracting wealth from Irish soil through Irish suffering. In 1857, Ireland was struggling. The Great Famine had been over for a decade, but its effects lingered. Land was valuable, tenants were vulnerable, and Ellis was the man who made poverty official. When news spread that Ellis had been shot, the Irish countryside didn't mourn, it whispered. In taverns, in fields, in country kitchens, people asked who had the courage to do it, who would pull that trigger. Because in Irish politics of the time, there was a simple truth. Killing a land agent wasn't murder, it was resistance. But the British authorities didn't see it that way. They saw a murder, an act of violence, a crime that required swift punishment and exemplary justice. And they were determined to find the killer. Arrests came quickly, very quickly, almost as if the police knew exactly who to look for. Among those detained, William and Daniel Cormack, brothers from Lochmore, a nearby townland. Here's what we know about the investigation. Police arrived at the scene quickly. They found Ellis dying. They heard Burke's account of seeing a figure fleeing into the darkness, and immediately the focus turned to the Cormack brothers. Now this is where historians start asking questions, because the investigation happened fast, too fast, almost premeditated. Within days, William and Daniel Cormack were arrested. So was a third man, but charges against him would be later dropped. He would testify against the Cormacks. Here's the key detail. Among those arrested were several people who had motive to kill Ellis. Tenant farmers he'd evicted, men who'd lost homes, men with genuine reasons to want him dead. But the police didn't focus on them. The police focused on the Cormacks. The evidence against them was thin, circumstantial at best. No weapon was found, no forensic evidence, and forensics barely existed then, but still, no eyewitnesses who definitively identified either brother as the shooter. What they had was Thomas Burke's statement. Thomas Burke, Ellis's own servant, testified that he recognised the figure fleeing the scene. He said it was William Cormack. Later, that testimony would be the foundation of the entire case, and later, Thomas Burke himself would admit the testimony was false. Think about that. The prosecution's star witness, the only eyewitness, the man who supposedly saw the killer's face in the darkness, would later admit he lied. And that admission came after the trial, after the conviction, after the death sentence. March 1858, the trial of William and Daniel Cormack. The courtroom is packed, hundreds of people outside. This is the trial everyone's watching, the murder of a land agent by presumed Irish rebels. British justice on trial. Presiding over the case, Judge William Keogh. Judge William Keogh is notorious, even by 19th century standards. Keogh has a reputation. He's known for harsh sentences, for favouring the prosecution, for, let's say, creative interpretations of the law when the law doesn't suit his purposes. He's also corrupt, openly corrupt, but he's a judge, so what are you going to do? Keogh presides over the trial with clear bias. Historians who have studied the case describe him as essentially conducting a prosecution from the bench rather than maintaining judicial impartiality. Prosecution's case rests almost entirely on Thomas Burke's identification and testimony. Burke claims he saw William Cormack fleeing the scene. Burke is adamant Burke is the eyewitness. The defence argues for reasonable doubt. The identification happened in darkness. Burke was shocked, frightened, confused. How can anyone be certain about what they saw? But Keogh wasn't buying it. There's another complication. An informer is involved. An informer who claims knowledge of the crime. This informer, described as a villainous character in contemporary accounts, testifies that the Cormacks were involved in planning the murder. But here's the problem. This same informer is widely believed to have been part of the actual murder plot. In other words, the man testifying against the Cormacks may well have been one of the actual killers. Why would the police use him as a witness instead of charging him? Nobody at the time had a satisfactory answer. The trial lasted several days. The evidence remained thin, but Keogh's bias was obvious. His rulings favoured the prosecution. His commentary from the bench suggested he'd already decided the brothers were guilty. The jury had 2,357 people willing to sign a petition attesting to the Cormack's innocence, but juries don't always represent the people. The jury voted guilty. Judge Keogh pronounced the death sentence. You will be taken from this place to a place of execution where you will be hanged by the neck until dead. And that was that. The trial was over, the brothers were condemned. Execution was set for May 11th. But something extraordinary happened. Something that showed how widely people believed in the brothers' innocence. After the conviction, a movement began, a petition, a desperate attempt to save 2 lives that the legal system had already decided to throw away. 2,357 people signed that petition, in a population where literacy was limited and most people had minimal legal recourse. 2,357 signatures was extraordinary. The petition was presented to authorities, arguing for a reprieve, arguing for reconsideration, arguing that the trial had been unjust. It didn't work. May 11th arrived, the day of execution. Here's where it gets remarkable. When the Cormack brothers were to be executed, the townspeople of Nenagh responded in a way that shocked the British authorities. They closed their shops. They didn't attend the execution. They refused to participate in what they understood was a miscarriage of justice. All the shops on the main street shut down. It wasn't a riot. It wasn't violence. It was something more powerful: collective refusal to legitimize the execution. On the scaffold, with the noose already placed, Daniel Cormack made his final statement. He proclaimed his innocence. He asked for prayers. William made similar proclamations, and then they were hanged. The crowd that day was small, sparse, because most of Nenagh had decided not to watch. The brothers were buried in the prison grounds, unmarked, just 2 more bodies in the jail's grounds. But they weren't forgotten, because 50 years later, something happened that would vindicate everything people had believed in 1858. The year is 1910. 52 years after the execution, a man is on his deathbed. His name is Michael Gleeson. He's a tenant farmer. He'd been evicted by John Ellis. And as he's dying, with a priest at his bedside, Michael Gleeson confesses. He confesses to murdering John Ellis. He names himself as the shooter. He describes the night. He explains how he waited in the darkness, how he shot Ellis as the cart passed, how he fled into the night. Gleeson describes the exact details of the crime, details only the actual killer would know. Michael Gleeson confesses to the murder for which the Cormack brothers were hanged 52 years earlier. 52 years. The brothers had been dead for half a century. They'd been buried without proper ceremony. They'd been remembered by their families and their community as victims of injustice, and now finally the truth emerges. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. Gleeson's confession didn't come from surprise or discovery. It came from his own conscience, his own need to make things right before he died. He wasn't forced to confess. He wasn't caught. He came forward because, according to the records, he couldn't carry the weight of the lie anymore. Gleeson had been motivated by something, probably the same thing that motivated whoever hired him or encouraged him. Land disputes, conflict with Ellis, probably connected to evictions and tenant rights. But whatever his motivation, whatever the politics involved, Gleeson couldn't die without telling the truth. So what happens after this confession? Legally, almost nothing. Gleeson died. There was no way to prosecute him. The case remained what it had always been, murder committed and unsolved for 50 years. Then confessed to by deathbed witness who couldn't be tried. But politically and socially, everything changed. In 1910, 2 years after Gleeson's confession, a committee was formed in Lockmore. The goal? Exhume the brothers' bodies from Nenagh jail and bring them home for proper burial. This wasn't a quiet administrative procedure. On the day the bodies were removed from Nenagh jail, the funeral procession that followed was described as one of the largest demonstrations of Irish nationalism seen in Tipperary up to that time. Tens of thousands of people lined the roads. 2 hearses drawn by horses with plumed black feathers, the coffins draped in flowers and nationalist symbols. And all these people, tens of thousands, came to witness the brothers finally coming home. The brothers were buried in a mausoleum in Lockmore churchyard, a permanent memorial to injustice and to vindication. The 1910 funeral became a powerful political statement. This is what we do to men like this, and this is how we remember what was done to them. It became a rallying point for Irish independence, a concrete example of how a British legal system had failed Irish people. In the years leading up to the Irish independence, the Cormack brothers' case was repeatedly cited. It became symbolic of something larger, how power corrupts justice, how systems designed to protect can be weaponized against the powerless. Judge Keogh, the corrupt judge who presided over the trial, had gone down in history as one of the most infamous Irish judges. His name is synonymous with judicial corruption. Thomas Burke, the perjuring witness, is remembered as someone who lied under oath and was never held accountable. And the Cormack brothers, they're remembered as martyrs. So here's what we know for certain. John Ellis was murdered on October 22nd, 1857, on a lane near Templemore. William and Daniel Cormack were arrested, tried, and executed for the murder on May 11th, 1858. The primary evidence against them was Thomas Burke's eyewitness testimony. Thomas Burke later admitted his testimony was false. Michael Gleeson confessed to the murder on his deathbed in 1910. The trial was presided over by a judge, William Keogh, a man with a reputation for corruption and bias. 2,357 people signed petitions claiming the brothers were innocent. The brothers proclaimed their innocence to the very end. Contemporary accounts describe the investigation as suspiciously swift. But here's what we don't know. Why did the police focus so quickly on the Cormack brothers specifically? Did they have actual evidence that's been lost to history, or did they just need someone to arrest? Who was the villainous informer who testified? What was his actual involvement in the crime? Who hired Michael Gleeson to kill Ellis? Or did he act alone? And what was Gleeson's actual motive? Why did Judge Keogh conduct the trial with such obvious bias? Did he have instructions from higher authorities? Or was this just his nature? What happened to Thomas Burke after he admitted his testimony was false? Was he ever prosecuted for perjury? Why was the confession of Michael Gleeson essentially ignored by the legal system? Why wasn't there an inquiry? We have the broad outline of the story, but we're missing crucial details. To understand why this case matters, you have to understand Ireland in 1857. The Great Famine had ended officially, but its effects lingered everywhere. Land is more valuable than ever. Landlords are ruthless. Tenant farmers are desperate. In this context, land agents like John Ellis become lightning rods. They're not abstract symbols of authority. They're the face of eviction. They're men who look tenant farmers in the eye and tell them to get out. In the 1850s, there's a growing movement of Irish resistance. Not organised rebellion yet, but with a groundswell of anger. Secret societies form. Acts of violence against landlords and land agents increase. In this environment, someone kills John Ellis. Maybe it's political assassination. Maybe it's personal revenge. Maybe it's a combination. But whatever the motivation, it plays directly into the fears of the British authorities. The idea that Irish rebels are targeting representatives of British rule. And so the authorities need to find someone to execute. They need to show that violence will be punished. They need to demonstrate that the law applies in Ireland. Enter the Cormack brothers. Maybe they were involved, maybe they weren't, but they became useful. The pattern, using the legal system as a tool of political control, would repeat in Ireland for decades. The Cormack case is one example, but it's not the only one. The trial of the Cormack brothers becomes, in retrospect, a symbol of how justice can be corrupt when politics and law intertwine. So here's what I actually think about the Cormack brothers case. The brothers were innocent. That's not speculation. Michael Gleeson's deathbed confession is as close to the truth as we can get. But the question of why they were executed, why the system worked so efficiently to convict them, that's more complex. Was there a conspiracy? Did authorities deliberately frame them knowing they were innocent? Or did a corrupt judge combined with a perjuring witness and a desire to solve the crime quickly, create a perfect storm that led to innocent men hanging. I think it's probably the latter. Not a deliberate conspiracy, but something more subtle and perhaps more dangerous. A system that doesn't require deliberate conspiracy to destroy innocent lives. A system where bias, corruption and urgency can combine to execute the wrong people. The legal system had failed the Cormack brothers, that much is clear. But the larger failure, the one that took 50 years to correct, was a failure of accountability. Nobody was ever held responsible for the false testimony. Judge Keogh's corruption was never formally addressed. The system had executed. Innocent men never reformed. What changed was not the system. What changed was Ireland's relationship to the system. The brothers' vindication became a powerful symbol that the British legal system couldn't be trusted, that power corrupts, that the powerless have no recourse, and that symbol mattered enormously in the years leading to Irish independence. Cormack brothers hanged for a murder that didn't commit. They proclaimed their innocence on the scaffold, and 50 years later their innocence was proven, but by then they were already dead. The question that lingers is, how many injustices go unproven? How many innocent people hang without ever getting their Michael Gleeson confession 50 years later? The Cormack brothers got justice eventually, but they had to be dead to get it.